They said it was an accident. I know it wasn't. My best friend didn't die on that road. She was pushed there long before the car ever hit her. My name is Helen Carter, and for over 30 years, Amina Brooks was the one person who knew every version of me. The hopeful one, the broken one, the woman I became after life taught me how cruel it could be. We met in our 20s, raised children side by side, and grew old sharing memories that no one else cared to hear anymore. People think old age comes with peace. It doesn't. It comes with invisibility. Amina used to say that quietly, usually with a small smile, as if she were apologizing for the truth. By the time she turned 70, she was living in her son Daniel's house. People assumed that meant she was safe, loved, taken care of. They were wrong. Daniel was her only child. She had raised him alone after her husband died in a factory accident decades earlier. She worked cleaning offices, washing dishes, doing anything that kept food on the table and shoes on his feet. She skipped meals so he could eat more. She ignored her own illnesses so she could pay his school fees. And in the end, she became a burden. When Daniel married Laura, everything changed. At first, Amina tried to stay invisible. Cooking quietly, cleaning what she could, staying in her room unless spoken to. She told me she didn't want to cause problems. She said, "It's their house now. I'm just here." Laura made sure Amina felt that truth every single day. It started with small things. Complaints about the food. Comments about electricity bills. Long sighs when Amina walked too slowly across the room. Then it became sharper. "You don't do anything all day," Laura would say loudly, making sure Amina heard. "You just sit there like furniture. You cost money and contribute nothing." Amina told me these things in pieces, never all at once. She always softened the words, as if protecting them from sounding as cruel as they really were. She blamed herself. She said she was old, weak, useless. What hurt her the most wasn't Laura's voice. It was Daniel's silence. He never defended her. Never corrected his wife. Never told her to stop. When Amina tried to speak, Daniel would look away. Or worse, he would tell her not to create drama. That phrase destroyed her. She told me once, sitting beside me on a park bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, "I carried him for 9 months. I carried groceries on my back for years. And now I am drama." She laughed when she said it, but her eyes didn't. I noticed the changes before anyone else did. Amina stopped calling. When she did, her voice sounded smaller. She lost weight. Her clothes hung loosely, like they belonged to someone else. She started apologizing for everything. For talking too much, for calling too late, for existing. Once, I asked her why she didn't come stay with me. She shook her head quickly. "I don't want to be a problem for you too." That's how deeply they had broken her. Inside that house, Amina lived like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. She ate after everyone else. She avoided the living room. She learned which floorboards creaked so she wouldn't be noticed at night. She timed her bathroom trips to avoid Laura. And Daniel watched it all happen. He told himself excuses, that marriage was hard, that Laura was stressed, that his mother would understand. He told himself that peace in his home mattered more than confronting cruelty. But peace built on someone else's suffering is just cowardice wearing a calm face. The last time I visited Amina at the house, I felt it in the air. The tension. The quiet hostility. Laura didn't look at me when I greeted her. Daniel barely spoke. Amina kept her eyes down. When I hugged her goodbye, her body felt fragile, like she might disappear if I let go. She whispered, "If anything happens to me, please remember me." I laughed it off. I told her she was being dramatic. I regret that more than I can ever explain. I didn't know that the walls of that house were already closing in on her. I didn't know that the night that would destroy everything was closer than either of us realized. Because cruelty doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently, until silence becomes permission. And that night, silence became abandonment. The night Amina was forced out of her son's house didn't begin with shouting. It began with exhaustion, the kind that settles deep into your bones and makes even breathing feel like work. She told me later that the house felt unusually cold that evening, even though the heater was on. Laura was in a bad mood from the moment she walked through the door. She slammed cabinets. She criticized the way the living room looked. She complained about money, about stress, about how nothing ever went right. Amina stayed in her room. That had become her safest place. A small bedroom with a narrow bed and a single lamp, barely large enough to hold the life she was slowly shrinking into. She sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to every sound, trying to make herself invisible. But invisibility never protects you from someone who wants a target. Laura started yelling about dinner. The food was cold. It was bland. It was wrong. Amina apologized from the hallway, her voice barely louder than a whisper. She offered to reheat it. She offered to make something else. That only made things worse. What exactly do you do here all day? Laura snapped. You eat, you sleep, you waste space. Daniel sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up. Amina stood there, hands trembling, trying to find words that wouldn't upset anyone. She had learned that silence was safer than honesty. But that night, something inside her finally cracked. I raised you, she said quietly, looking at Daniel. I'm not asking for much. Just respect. The room went silent. Daniel looked up slowly, irritation flashing across his face. Not at his wife, but at his mother. Why are you starting this? He asked. Can't you see Laura is already stressed? Amina stared at him, disbelief and pain mixing in her eyes. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't insulted anyone. She had simply asked not to be humiliated. Laura laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. See, she said. This is exactly what I mean. She always plays the victim. Something ugly entered Daniel's expression then. He stood up, pushed his chair back loudly, and spoke words that Amina would carry with her until her last breath. This is my house, he said. And I won't let anyone ruin my marriage. If you can't live peacefully here, maybe you shouldn't live here at all. Amina felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She looked at her son, the boy she once carried on her hip, the child she protected from storms and hunger, and waited for him to take it back. To soften. To remember who she was. He didn't. Laura crossed her arms, satisfied. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to go. Amina didn't cry. Not then. She simply nodded, slowly, as if her body was moving before her heart could catch up. I'll go, she said. Daniel didn't stop her. He didn't ask where she would sleep. He didn't offer her money or a ride. He didn't even look ashamed. She packed silently. A small bag. A sweater. Her worn wallet with barely anything inside. She paused in the doorway one last time, hoping, foolishly, that Daniel would say something. He didn't. The door closed behind her with a sound that echoed louder than any scream. She stepped into the night with nowhere to go. The air was cold, biting through her thin coat. The street lights flickered. Cars passed by without slowing. She stood there for a moment, unsure which direction to walk, feeling like the world had suddenly erased her place in it. She walked. And walked. And walked. Bus stops became her resting places. Park benches her beds. The city moved around her like she was already dead. People avoided her eyes. Some looked irritated. Others didn't look at all. She skipped meals so often that hunger stopped feeling sharp and started feeling dull, like a constant ache she couldn't escape. Her legs swelled. Her chest hurt when she breathed too deeply. Sleep came in fragments, always broken by cold or fear. I didn't know any of this at first. When I tried calling her, her phone went straight to voicemail. I assumed she needed space. I assumed she was embarrassed. I assumed I had time. That assumption will haunt me forever. Amina spent days wandering the city, trying to remember places where she once felt safe. Churches. Libraries. Shelters that were full or closed or too far away. She didn't ask for help easily. Pride had been beaten into her, but not completely erased. Once, she sat outside a grocery store for hours, watching people walk past with bags of food. She told me later she wasn't begging. She was remembering. Remembering when she used to be someone. Her body grew weaker. Her mind foggier. Loneliness wrapped itself around her tighter than any blanket ever could. She started talking to herself, not because she was losing her sanity, but because silence had become unbearable. The worst part wasn't the hunger. It was knowing that her son had chosen a quieter life without her in it. One evening, After days without real food or sleep, her vision blurred. Traffic lights stretched into streaks of color. The noise of the city became overwhelming. Horns, voices, engines all blending into chaos. She wandered toward a busy road, not fully aware of where she was going. Her thoughts weren't clear. Her body was failing. Her heart was exhausted from carrying too much pain for too long. She stepped forward. And then everything stopped. The police called me the next morning. They asked if I knew an Amina Brooks. I remember dropping the phone. I remember screaming. I remember realizing that while I was living my ordinary life, my best friend had been erased from the world. Not by an accident, but by neglect, cruelty, and a silence that had gone on for far too long. By the time Amina Brooks was fully on her own, the city had become both her world and her tormentor. The first night out was nothing like she expected. It wasn't just the cold. It was the realization that no place would protect her. The sidewalks were hard. The benches were unforgiving. The shadows of buildings stretched long and indifferent. She moved from one street corner to another, dragging her small bag, her sweater threadbare and stiff from days of washing it in park fountains. Hunger gnawed at her like a persistent reminder of every meal she had skipped while living under her son's roof. Hunger was physical, yes, but it was also emotional. Every pang reminded her of the humiliation she had endured, the love that had been denied, the respect that had never been earned. Amina tried shelters at first. She stood in lines for hours, only to be turned away because the spaces were full, or because she didn't have identification, or because the shelters preferred younger, healthier people who could contribute in some way. She began to understand a cruel truth. Society only valued those who could serve a purpose. The elderly, the weak, the dependent, they were invisible. Days blended into nights. Amina slept in parks, curled on benches with her coat pulled tight around her frail frame. The city lights mocked her with their warmth. Cars drove past, their headlights catching the outline of her hunched figure, and yet no one stopped. Sometimes people muttered curses. Other times, they pretended she wasn't there at all. She wasn't used to being unseen. Not this way. Not by strangers. Not after having spent her life raising a son, working tirelessly, giving everything she had to others. Her body began to betray her. Weak muscles ached from carrying her own weight across endless blocks. Her feet blistered from shoes that had long lost their soles. Her hands, once strong enough to knead dough and carry groceries, trembled when she tried to open cans or bottles she begged for. Hunger was relentless, but exhaustion was worse. Nights were spent fighting the wind and the chill. Mornings were spent fighting dizziness and fatigue. And yet, the mental anguish was more unforgiving than the physical. Loneliness clung to her, a shadow that never left. Memories of her son's home haunted her. The silent meals, the backhanded words of her daughter-in-law, the cold eyes of the boy she had raised. Every flashback tore at her heart, and sometimes she whispered to herself, trying to hear her own voice over the endless ache of rejection. She started talking to strangers in small ways. A gentle hello to a man walking his dog. A quiet thank you to the cashier who handed her a cup of leftover food at the convenience store. Most ignored her. Some were annoyed. Very rarely, someone offered a glance of sympathy, but it never lasted long enough to feel real. Amina's health deteriorated steadily. She lost weight until her cheeks were hollow, her eyes sunken. Her skin became fragile and pale. Every cough rattled her frail frame. But worse than the sickness was the erosion of spirit. The woman who once carried her son through life, who had laughed, danced, and shared stories with friends, now shuffled silently, hoping no one would notice her. Sometimes she sat on the edge of a fountain in the park and cried silently, her tears freezing on her cheeks as winter air bit through her sweater. She whispered apologies into the night, to her son, to her friends, to anyone who might be listening. She apologized for being old, for being poor, for existing at all. I didn't know all of this at the time. I only realized the depth of her suffering when the police called me to identify her body. They told me she had been wandering the city alone for weeks. They told me she had passed quietly, unnoticed, until the accident. And I finally understood that the streets had been her final home, her loneliness her constant companion. She had begged for shelter, begged for food, begged for recognition of her humanity, and in every case, the world turned away. Even her son, the one who had promised to protect her, had chosen peace with his wife over his mother's life. Amina's existence on the streets was a slow unraveling, a death that started long before the final moment. Hunger, humiliation, sickness, and isolation all worked together to break her down. Each day she survived was a day of quiet suffering. A day marked not by violence, but by indifference. And then one evening, after weeks of wandering, shivering, and struggling to stay upright, she stumbled toward a busy road. Her body was too weak to stand firmly. Her mind, exhausted by hunger and grief, struggled to stay present. Lights blurred together. Noise became unbearable. The city's chaos swallowed her. Her steps faltered. Her thoughts wandered. And in that moment of confusion, despair, and utter exhaustion, she stepped forward. I wish I could have been there. I wish I could have stopped her. But I wasn't. She was alone when the car hit. Completely, utterly alone. The phone call came early in the morning. Ms. Carter? We need you to come to the station. There's been an accident. A woman. We think she may be Amina Brooks. I froze. My hand went to my chest, and my breath caught. I knew. I had known the moment they said, accident. I knew, because her absence had been screaming in my mind for days, haunting every quiet moment. When I arrived at the station, the officer led me to a room I will never forget. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. On the table lay Amina, her body still, fragile, almost unreal. Her face was bruised, her hands cold, but her eyes were closed in peace, finally free of the fear and pain she had carried for so long. I couldn't speak at first. All the words I had rehearsed in my mind vanished. I reached out and touched her hand. Thin, fragile, almost translucent. I wanted to tell her I was sorry. I wanted to tell her I had failed her. I wanted to scream at the world for letting this happen. She didn't need my words anymore. I remembered the first day I realized how invisible she had become. The way her own son had chosen silence over protection. The way the streets had swallowed her like she had never existed. The betrayal, the cruelty, and the neglect had done more damage than any accident ever could. And now, here she was gone. The coroner said it was a traffic accident. Technically, yes. But I knew better. Amina didn't die because a car hit her. She died because the world, starting with her own family, turned its back. She died from hunger. From exhaustion. From rejection. From the quiet, relentless cruelty that had started in her own home. I closed my eyes and let memories of her wash over me. Her laugh, once loud and warm. Her small, careful gestures of kindness. The way she would sit with me, her hand resting on mine, listening to my worries as if mine were the most important thing in the world. I remembered the night she left her house. I remembered the helplessness in her eyes as she nodded to Daniel and walked out into the dark. I remembered how small and fragile she looked against the towering city, how alone she was, and how unfair it was. I don't know how the world continued to spin after that. I don't know how people went to work, drove their cars, met their friends, while she struggled to survive with no one noticing, no one helping. And now she was gone. I promised myself then that I would make sure her story was heard, that people would know what cruelty and neglect can do, that they would remember that sometimes the deepest wounds are caused not by strangers, but by those who were supposed to protect us the most. I carried her funeral alone. Few came. A handful of neighbors, some distant cousins, and me, the one who knew her soul. I spoke at the service, my voice trembling. She was a woman who gave everything for her family, yet in the end, she was given nothing. She deserves to be remembered. She deserves our care, our respect, and our humanity. Tears streamed down my face. I wished more than anything that she could have heard me. That she could have felt, even for a moment, the love and respect she had been denied in life. The truth is, Amina Brooks was more than the tragedy of her death. She was a warning. A mirror held up to anyone who thinks neglect is harmless, who believes that silence is safety, who forgets that every person deserves dignity. I left her grave that day carrying a weight I cannot describe. The weight of guilt, the weight of grief, and the weight of a story that had to be told. She is gone. But her life, her suffering, her courage, her quiet dignity, cannot be erased. Sometimes, when I walk past a park bench or see an elderly person struggling to carry groceries, I see her. I hear her whisper, gentle but firm. Remember me. Don't let this happen to anyone else. And I do. every single day. Because Amina Brooks wasn't just my best friend. She was a testament to love, endurance, and the unbearable cruelty that the world can sometimes inflict. Her death is a silent question to all of us. How many more lives are being broken quietly, invisibly, while the world looks the other way? And the answer? We all already know.